Hello everyone and welcome to the Love of Wisdom Book Club. I'm joined once again by Rebecca Mattis, and this time we're talking about How Emotions Are Made by Dr Lisa Feldman Barrett. This book explores the neuroscience of emotions, how that relates to our linguistic and perceptual concepts, and how that relates to our experiences, and some of the implications for that as well. We were both quite critical of this book, but I will say that I first listened to this book. I listened to the audiobook before I read it, but I first listened to this book maybe 6 months ago, and it has been a frequent topic of consideration and reflection for me. So although I have many criticisms of the conclusions that are drawn, I think that the book is very, very interesting. And the fact that it gave me that much food for thought shows that it has a great deal of merit in and of itself. Obviously, I always recommend that people read with a level of critical eye anyway. Doesn't always have to be in the first instance. Sometimes you just want to enjoy it, but we should certainly reflect on books with a degree of criticality rather than just assuming them to be accurate and correct. But it's also very valuable to engage with ideas you don't agree with as much as it is with those that you do agree with, and I continue to try and do that. And I'm hoping that I have some more content that should be out fairly soon. I just have to find time to edit it at the moment, but that should demonstrate this as well, because some of that content is going to include engaging with ideas that are outside of my usual sphere, and are probably those that I'm more critical of in an effort to pursue intellectual honesty by challenging myself and engaging with the ideas that I don't agree with, and mitigating against my own biases that may exist to the degree that I can. Obviously, I'll do it imperfectly. I am but a human being, but hopefully you will enjoy coming on that journey with me, and hopefully you will enjoy this conversation as much as I do.
So, How Emotions Are Made by Dr Lisa Feldman Barrett. I read this book quite some time ago. I haven't actually reread it properly. I sort of skimmed over it, read the titles of the chapters, and realised that I'd spent so much time thinking about the themes of this book that there was no real benefit for me reading it a second time at this stage. I felt very equipped to have this conversation already, but you've read it more recently. And obviously we've picked out some key themes to sort of start with. And the first one that I felt, I don't know if you feel, so following the sort of narrative of the book, the first point she sort of made was a lack of universality of emotions, but then she sort of went into the brain, how the brain works in terms of, is it predictive or reactionary in terms of processing information and creating our experience and our perception. So I feel like that is fundamental before even getting into the emotions. So does that seem like a good place to start to you?
Sure.
What did you make of the, what would be your understanding of what the case she was trying to make in terms of whether the brain is predictive or reactive?
So I can't stand the word predictive. It really is a stumbling block in my way. I much prefer a different sort of word, like iterative, perhaps, or even assumptive, or it's, to me, that most of our experience, we're going around and most of the background is unchanging, and so the brain is just, it's not refreshing that data stream. It's just like, okay, I'm going to assume that that's how everything is happening. And then the only time you see something new is when something is there that wasn't in your, we can say, prediction. So I get why the word prediction is there, because the brain is kind of putting stuff out like a millisecond ahead of time. It's saying, okay, what's happening in this millisecond is going to happen in the next millisecond. Okay, fair enough. But the way the author was, I feel like she was extrapolating that into much wider contexts and narratives that just seemed bizarre to me. And she seemed to say that the only way you can possibly see a snake is if you foretell a snake. And that there's never an occasion where you are looking at a snake and realizing that you see a snake without having foretold that you were going to see a snake. And it's that aspect of foretelling, which is a literal translation of the word predict, that I really stumble on, and I don't know if it's helpful. Okay. In fact, I think it's unhelpful.
So if I take that example of the snake and propose how I view that working from the predictive brain theory that she's sort of proposing as the method that we process that information. So my understanding of the predictive model would be that if you see a snake on the floor, your perceptions. So when you look at, I think we had this conversation a little bit when I was last on a ferry back from Ireland. We were talking about differences in shades of brown. But when you look at any given sort of environment, background, whatever you want to call it, whenever you look at some sort of setting, say like immediately behind me, I've got the laptop screen with both our faces on, and then I've got two more computer monitors and a whiteboard and things like that. But I see that as a series of delineated objects. Whereas it's not quite clear how those objects should be delineated perceptually, because as it actually appears to my eyes without me delineating those objects, there's just a mess of different sort of colors and the edge, it shouldn't be that obvious why the edge of the laptop is the edge of the laptop and not just a change in color of the same object. But I perceive it as a change in object, and there are very useful reasons for that, because I can maneuver the laptop separate from the desk, because they are materially separate from one another. So in terms of my visual perception of that, though, there is something that I'm equipped with, which you could argue is innate, in that we see objects as separate. But you could also, I'm not sure how necessarily clear that is when you look at sort of experiments with young children and their ability to perceive objects and create mental representations of objects. There's a very famous experiment with the kids who are sort of asked to draw an object from different angles, and below a certain age they can only draw exactly what they see in front of them. They can't rotate that object in their minds or anything like that, so they don't have a clear concept of that object as necessarily separate from their immediate visual experience. And so if you were to see a snake, the actual visual input you're getting is just a series of colors with a shape, the shape remarkably similar to a snake, and your brain for your brain to stop and go, okay, I know that's a snake, trigger the response to snake, would be potentially slower than going snake-like object. Here's how many possible outcomes that could be, and here's how I need to respond according to what seems like the most probable, and then it starts to correct itself in real time as it gets more data, because you need to, if you see a snake in terms of survival benefits, you have to be able to react as quickly as possible, because snakes would have been a significant predator for humans for a huge portion of our life, our existence, sorry. And so the predictions aren't big or grand. They're sort of like almost working in the milliseconds. It's like, what is the probable outcome of this? And you see it. There was that trend for a while of cats being showed cucumbers and freaking out because they saw it as a snake. And that appears to me to be something very similar, where it's basically like, object that, based on prior experience and innate perceptual faculties, has a reasonable possibility of being a snake. So I'm going to react as if it were a snake, because that's going to create the highest probability of survival. And if it's not a snake, then I can correct for that over time.
Yeah. So stop right there. So I'm totally with you. Number one, I think it's absolute. So I believe it's true that people have an innate ability to develop they have the innate ability to develop the ability to perceive the edges of things. And it's an ability that you lose if you're blind for a long time, as we learn with people who were sighted as little children and then became blind, and then they got their vision back quite a lot of years later, and they can't tell what are the edges of anything, and they can't tell that a dark shadow isn't an object, for example. And so I think that's true. We have the ability to learn it. That's innate, and we need experience in order to learn it. So yes. But as to the snake, when I see something that looks like a snake, I think snake every single time. I don't believe that my brain wastes energy on running a bunch of probabilistic, charts. I don't think it's like, oh, well, 1,000 of my predictions, I've got 1,000 predictions to make. 698 of them are going to be snake. 24 of them are going to be a piece of string. 237 are going to be a zucchini. That's what the author described in the book. She didn't present any evidence that that's how it worked. She didn't talk about why anyone thinks that that's how it works, that the brain is running all of these simultaneous predictions. Maybe the brain is, but I'm not convinced. That's certainly not what I experience. I experience snake, and then I correct based on further data. So, it's a snake because it's a curved thing that's on the ground. But it's actually a piece of string because it actually looks like a piece of string. And now that I've had a few more milliseconds to look at it, I can see that clearly. So I just don't think that my brain is simultaneously going, snake, piece of string, zucchini.
So, yeah, that, would it be fair to characterize that as being an issue more with the idea of the number of simultaneous predictions being run than the idea of predictions being run per se?
I'm totally down with predictions.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that, because the other thing that I think of there is the issue with the error correction in that, because you will, when you see a snake-like object and you react as if it were a snake, you probably experienced a heightened state of arousal and several sort of changes, physiological and emotional changes that are based on what is needed to react to that snake appropriately. And once you, if say there is a few seconds, even 2 seconds, for you to go, oh wait, it's not a snake, it's a courgette, or zucchini as you would say. That's a courgette. Your emotional and physiological state will take some time to dissipate and return to the base level of calm that it was at prior. And we've all encountered something similar where something takes us by surprise. We jump, our heart rate goes up, we feel fear of some description, or we're startled, and we then realise that it's just our friend jumping out from around a corner and not the crazy axe murderer, and we remain slightly elevated in heart rate, slightly more stressed, perhaps gathering our breath slightly. All these sort of physiological symptoms don't dissipate instantly. So that appears to me, and I think that's the case that Barrett was making in the book, that is the brain sort of going, well, there is new input data that suggests that the prediction was incorrect, but the prediction was significant, and therefore we have to sort of stay alert a little bit just in case our error correction is actually in error.
Huh. If that's what she said, I never remember her or anyone saying that. That's an interesting idea.
She definitely made the case that we can be very slow to correct our physiological state for prediction error, and sometimes we will hold on to a false prediction based on the relevance of speed at which the information is communicated back to the brain, or the relevant parts of the brain.
I mean, that part, yes. But in terms of the brain deciding that the heart rate is going to stay elevated for a little while because snakes really are dangerous and we don't want to let go of the idea that it still might be a snake, I'm not so sure about that.
Well, I'm not sure it's so much that it's deciding to hold on to that. It's more reluctant to let go of it, if that makes sense. I know that sounds slightly like a semantic difference, but
no, but fair enough. But even then, I just kind of thought that when I just thought it takes time for the heart to slow down, not because of the stories the brain is telling or the predictions it's making, but just because it does. I don't think a heart rate just can go from 120 to 60 in.
But I don't think it can either. But I think the reason it can is because the way our physiology works is because there's no reason. So if you've got a metronome, for example, you can change a metronome from 120 beats per minute to 60 beats per minute in a split second. There's no reason for it to not do that. But I think that our heart rate gets elevated because our brain tells our body, I mean, it's a bit of a false dichotomy to separate the brain and the body because they are ultimately the same thing. But we basically we induce a state, or something induces a state at which it's felt that a greater level of blood oxygen is going to be needed around the body, and certain things are going to be needed to function quicker and more effectively. So your heart rate goes up when you've been running because you sort of convince your body that running is something necessary, and it's going to attribute the resources necessary to facilitate that activity. When you stop, I see that as your brain sort of lagging behind, and because this makes the brain sound somewhat computeristic, but the speed at which signals transmitted around the body is very, very quick. But so the signal saying we're not running now, we could reduce the heart rate to 60 or whatever the resting heart rate is, should be able to be communicated very quickly, because we know information could go the other way very quickly, because you can get your heart rate from 60 to 120 in the space of 5 or 10 seconds if you sort of exert yourself. It can't do it the other way around, because to me, I get the impression there's probably an element that there's a physiological expense of recovery, in terms of, your muscles have just been used, so they still need slightly more blood oxygen. But it's also a case of it's lagging behind, going, well, we've only just stopped running, maybe we're going to need to run again, maybe the need for running may not have disappeared. And I think that, based on a sort of evolutionary perspective of what's going to create differential survival rates, it is far more in our interest to be able to go from rest to high alert and high arousal very quickly than it is to be able to go from high arousal to rest very quickly. And it's probably not very advantageous to go from states of high arousal to rest very quickly, because the absence of a threat in a given moment does not mean that threat is indefinitely absent. It still may persist. Say, if you were being chased by a wolf,
that makes sense.
The moment the wolf appears, you need to be alert. If you lose sight of the wolf for a second, you don't go, oh, everything's fine, and sit down.
Yeah, sure. I mean, okay, fine. Well enough. I mean, okay, I see a snake, my heart rate goes up, it's a piece of string, it still takes a little while for it to go down. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, and I could give another example, because I'm terrible with spiders. I've gotten better, but big ones I can't handle. If I see a big spider on my curtain, I go straight away into a high state of arousal. If that spider disappears, I maintain that high state of arousal for ages, and I start imagining things that aren't spiders to be spiders. And I strongly suspect that's my brain going, there's a spider here somewhere. Oh, that's a spider, that's a spider, that's a spider. And just trying to, every little feeling or every little bit of sense data appears to be a spider for a brief period of time, until I eventually go, okay, that takes quite a long time.
I was putting on my pants the other day, and I had them on, and I saw that a gigantic spider had been in them, and that I had kicked it out when I put my pants on, and it was on the floor, and it was this big.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting moment. Did
you spend a period of time then having something in your mind going, worrying or considering whether there's more spiders in your trousers?
Oh, no, not at all. I just felt very lucky that it hadn't gotten stuck there, that it was like now on the floor, and how fortunate that was, and now needed to be dealt with. But I really like spiders, but I'm still startled by them.
Yeah, I had a horrible experience as a child where I put some wellies on, and there was a fairly substantially sized spider in one of the wellies, and I sort of put them on and walked out the front door, and then felt it running around in my wellie, and was desperately panicking and trying to kick off my wellies. And when I eventually did manage to kick them off, the spider was long dead, because it had been crushed in all the sort of like kicking and stuff like that. But I was terrified to put wellies on for a very long time, and every time I put them on, I'd spend ages banging them and shaking them upside down just in case there was a spider there. I couldn't let go of it. So
that's probably a good habit.
Creates a whole lot of negative predictions.
Anyway, so I'm eager to keep going in the conversation. As far as predictions, well, I don't know if you wanted to get into prediction of emotion next, or if...
I mean, I think they're going to overlap, but one of the biggest things for me that came out of prediction was how it merged with other sort of theoretical perspectives with a fairly good base of evidence. So like attachment theory was one of the ones that sprung out to me, because that's a big part in the work that I do. It's a it's a very sort of significant finding from psychology, and it's crucial. And attachment theory basically posits that your early caregiving relationships form how you feel about the world. So if they are secure and protective, and you are able to feel that they enable you to feel safe about the world. Because basically, when I was thinking about this from the predictive brain model, I was like, if you have someone who comes to your aid when there are issues initially, then you feel more able to go and explore and potentially encounter issues, because you learn that in these situations, if things go wrong, things work out all right. And then as you sort of grow and you sort of, to use Vygotsky's sort of zone of proximal development, you encounter more challenges to yourself that you handle independently, and you learn that those challenges, when faced independently, turn out all right most of the time if you sort of conduct yourself in a certain way. But then you get this sort of replication in, and there is very clearly a genetic component to attachment theory as well that is often overlooked. So I don't want to sort of paint it out as if it's all entirely relationship based, which I think is one of my big criticisms of the book, is that it often went from, well, if we have, it sort of painted prediction and reaction as a binary distinction, whereas I saw it more as a spectrum where there's a little bit of both, because to me it's a completely semantic difference to say whether there is prediction and error correction or prediction and reaction, because error correction is just a reaction to external stimulus. It's the same thing as far as I can tell, and it's just a case of the terminology used. But people who have experienced sort of certain patterns of behavior in their relationships, either as a child or as an adult, then come to expect those patterns of behaviors in their relationships going forward. And you see it quite often where people fail to distinguish completely between separate relationships. No one judges a single relationship, whether using relationship in the broad sense to include friendships, based purely on the specifics of that relationship. There's a whole load of things they bring to that, in terms of how they expect people to treat them, how they expect people to react, and so it's sort of built up over time. And this has been quite well studied for a very long time. And when I was reading about the predictive brain thing, I sort of had this, that makes complete sense, because if you think of the brain as reactive, then you would purely reactive, then you would expect every relationship to be judged entirely on its own merits. And it's very clear that human beings don't behave like that.
Okay, that you are explaining prediction much, much, much better than Lisa Feldman Barrett did.
Well, she has a PhD and I don't. So I will I'll accept that as your opinion. I don't think I can entirely accept it as a
no way. It's I mean, her I'm going to take a minute to gripe about this author. I promise I won't do it for very long, but the whole book, most of the book is spent on debunking instead of on explaining. And she's so into debunking the classical view of this and the classical view of that. And it just, she spends hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages debunking. And as she's debunking, she's telling you, or she's telling me that I think what I do not think. She's telling me that I do not think what I do think. And so all of her debunking goes nowhere because she's telling me stuff that isn't true. And she's self-contradictory. She'll contradict herself on pages that are just facing each other. And so it just no. Your explanation was way better. I don't care about the PhD. No. I mean, anyway, forget it. That's my complaint.
That's fair enough. But I'm sure so when I first read the book, or actually I first listened to it on audiobook, I found it quite compelling when I first read it. But I think it was Brett Weinstein who once said, isn't it funny how for the first 10 days after you read a book, you're the author's biggest fan? And when I first went through it, I was like, this is really interesting. And then the more time passed and the more I reflected on it, I was sort of like, actually, there's massive holes in a significant portion of it. And there are many things that I think that there's a lot of flawed reasoning. And I also think there are some misrepresentations or over-exaggerations or over-extrapolations from the research that she's using. So talking about sort of perception and the prediction, we had this debate about colour going back and forth for quite some time, and her claim in the book is that we distinguish a palette of colour from into categories through having these concepts which are socially constructed. So we have a social construct of red that enables us to look at a rainbow and go, okay, that red is not yellow. Whereas actually, if you look at colour, doesn't have those clear delineations between it. And this is sort of goes back to what I was saying about seeing the laptop as distinct from its background. Because if you look at the most clear visual example I can think of is Microsoft Paint, where you go onto the color palette and everything sort of blurs into each other, and there's sort of a slightly more red, yellow, and an orange, and different degrees of this depending on the light waves. If you want to get into the really technicalities of it, but I don't think that's interesting or necessary at this point in time. It is interesting, but not in this context. And one of the pieces of research she referenced, which I've come across being referenced in a number of places, was the fact that in Russian there are distinct words for light blue and dark blue. Or I think it was light blue and dark blue. There's basically more words for different shades of blue than there is in the English language. And experiments have shown that Russians detect difference in shades of blue slightly quicker than people who don't have the words for it. And I thought that's really interesting, and it does support what she's saying. Then I read the research and read a few other takes on the research, and I was like, actually, yes, there is a difference, but she's overstating what the difference is, because it's like an absolutely minuscule difference that only emerges in very specific lab conditions. And that does show there is some element, it sort of suggests there's some element of what she's saying is the case at play, but there's a much more significant element of other things, such as us generally having a clear ability to distinguish between different shades of blue that's roughly comparable. And I felt that it was slightly, I don't want to say disingenuous, because I don't feel like she was necessarily doing this deliberately. I don't want to give her a lot more credit than that. I do think she was quite honest I just think that she allowed her goals to bias her interpretations at points. And so I think that she's so convinced by her own theories about how we interpret everything, that she saw this as far more concrete proof of the social construction of those perceptions than it actually did, because it suggested that the difference is minuscule in specific conditions, and therefore actually the difference that's created by having those distinctions isn't huge.
Yeah, and then there's, I mean, I have a really nice ability to distinguish one color from another if they're next to each other. I'm, probably as good as anyone. But and I have all kinds of color words, all kinds. I have a rich color vocabulary, but I still can't tell you whether a particular flower is blue or purple. I don't know. I can't tell. Is it blue? Is it purple? Sometimes it's obviously purple. Sometimes it's obviously blue. Sometimes I cannot tell. And so clearly that is a case of having all kinds of words for stuff just doesn't help. And it gets similar with shades of purple. When a purple is on the blue end and a purple is on the red end, when does it become red? I don't know. So I'll stop griping. Yes, I think she was overstating her case, and because she's all on fire of what she wants to show. So, and it just, unfortunately for me, it fell very short. But I still think she's onto something. Like, she asks a lot of really good questions in the book. I just don't think she ever answers them very well. But I think she's getting somewhere. She's onto something. And so that's what I was trying to cling to as I read. It's like, well, okay, well, what is she saying, or what is she trying to say that's of value? And I think the most important thing, even though I disagree with probably, I don't know, 75% of the way that she chose to explain it, like, oh, there's no such thing as facial expressions, and oh, this and that, is that emotions are very different all the time, and that an emotion is not just one thing, and it can differ from moment to moment within a person, and it can differ from person to person. And if such an emotion exists in an animal, it's got to be different between the person and the animal, most likely. So I think that point is, well, for me, it was I was going to say it was a very well taken point, but I think I already believed that anyway. So she didn't actually convince me of anything. She just,
So, obviously, I don't think you've done this, but what that makes me want to say is, so
it's just confirmation bias.
Yeah, you read the book and basically you agreed with all the bits you believed beforehand and disagreed with all the bits you didn't.
Almost, yeah, almost. The things that I'm coming around to now that you've explained it are prediction, and maybe some other things, but so, yeah, but to me that says something more about the book than it does about me.
Yeah,
because a better author would have been more convincing.
Yeah, and I know you well enough, and hopefully my viewers know you from our previous conversations well enough to know that you are more than willing to change your mind in the face of compelling evidence and argumentation. So it was only a comical jive rather than anything with any intent behind it. But what you were saying there about, you sort of touched on the case of what Darwin style sort of population thinking in terms of emotions, and it sort of was at play with what you were saying about colour as well, where there's no universal sort of like facial expression or behaviour associated with fear, to just use a random category. But there are many different ways in which fear can manifest itself. And so we sort of have this broad category of fear to describe many different behaviours and responses to a given situation. And this is why I found her categorized, and she's definitely not the first or alone in making this categorization of emotion, because I've heard it. For example, Andrew Huberman, who does the Huberman Lab podcast, I've heard him speak of emotion in a similar way, of valence and arousal. So valence is like positive or negative, and that's sort of a spectrum, and arousal is basically like alert or at rest, and that's a spectrum. And so you sort of have this cross section of like valence, like positive, negative, high arousal, low arousal, and you then sort of get this, I don't know what the word would be, you sort of get this palette of different areas that you can be on that as a response to any of them. And so, say, fear and excitement might both be very high arousal, but the difference will be where they are on the positive, negative aspect of it. So they might both be over this side of on the arousal level, but more positive or negative valence. And I found this concept for considering emotions, I actually find far more useful than any emotional label in and of itself. Not that it's particularly useful for communicating with other people. You don't sort of say, "Hi, how are you?" "Oh, I'm moderate arousal and high and positive valence, thank you very much." That would be weird and convoluted and unnecessary, and so the words sort of become shortcuts. Is my sort of interpretation of it. But what did you make of that sort of aspect of it, the valence arousal spectrum?
Well, I've been used to thinking about emotions in that way for so long. I mean, just the longest time. So that wasn't anything new to me. And I really like thinking about emotions that way. And I actually tried to map out emotions on that on that set of axes. But I kind of gave up because it was just getting ridiculous, and because of so many of the words contained narrative, like pretty much every word contained a social narrative. And so I would have had to make it a three-dimensional space where there was some sort of status, either status threat or status buildup. And I want to think about that more. Anger, for example, is going to be found in a threat to status, whereas something like being thrilled or satisfied is going to be more likely to be found in a status boost. Anyway, so I plan on thinking about that more in life, but I find that really helpful. And it's in the book, she used the word affect, seem a little bit distinctly from the way that I've seen the word affect used elsewhere. And so I was a little confused by it. And I don't even know if these semantic stuff is important. Like, does it really matter how she uses the word affect and how Wikipedia uses the word affect? But pleasure and distress, that's something I think we all agree that not only all people have, but that animals have, and you can see that on the face, and you can see it in the body, like a lot. Maybe not every face. You can't always tell, I guess, between a face of pleasure and distress sometimes, if it's pretty high arousal. But generally speaking, you can tell someone who's crying from someone who's happy. Although, are they crying from happiness? I just dug myself into a hole. Forget it.
Well, I have two questions arising from that, and I think they're probably quite linked. One is, what exactly do you mean by there are narratives? So, affect, to me, just to clarify, to make sure we're using the same word, affect is basically a less specific term than emotion, and it relates to the feeling of being on that spectrum, the arousal and valence spectrum that we discussed. So affect just talks about, is basically where on that palette of potential feelings or states are you. And so my question is, when you put an emotion label onto that, what do you mean by that having a narrative connotation? And my second question is, in interpreting someone else's affect or emotion, do you think that is, what do you think the role of context in your interpretation is?
Those are such different questions. So the first one, you wanted to know where this concept of narrative goes. Ask the first question again.
I just want, what you say, that when you put a sort of all the emotional labels, when you try to plot them out on an affect spectrum, you described them as having a narrative embedded in them, a social narrative, and I'm wondering what you mean by that, if you could elaborate on what you mean.
So I want to take a detour and talk about NVC. So Marshall Rosenberg developed this philosophy called nonviolent communication. Stupid title, great philosophy. It's about understanding your emotions and understanding how they're linked to human needs and values. So he is, or was, because he's dead now, he was very, very persnickety about using words that only represented emotions without judgment. So he would not let you say, I am feeling betrayed. Because when you say, I am feeling betrayed, you are making a judgment on another person that they betrayed you. And so his advice was to try to understand what are actually the feelings, the affects that are the basis of that sense that you say, oh, I feel betrayed. Well, how do you feel? You feel surprised. You feel distressed. And then you also have a sense of a loss of trust. So the surprise is just, that's can I just call it animalistic or affective? Surprise is a thing that happens to you. You get surprised. And then sad, or you feel bad. You feel, distressed. Okay, again, that's an animalistic thing. But the loss of a sense of trust is more of a narrative. It's talking about what is happening in your life. It fits in with a story. And so that's what makes it betrayal, is this loss of a sense of trust. And so now in nonviolent communication, you would say, oh, I have a loss of a sense of trust. And it's not putting a judgment on someone. It's not pointing a finger at someone. You betrayed me. It's just like, well, I don't feel trusting right now. So that would be like, okay, in his philosophy. But that's what I mean when I'm talking about the narrative component. And just so many feeling words have that narrative component. I can think of some that don't, like calm, excited. I mean, that's just talking about valence, right? But things like sadness, anger, delight, so many things. Why would you feel delight? Well, you're feeling aroused, you're feeling positive. But delight, there's something that you're delighting in. There's content there, and maybe that's so. There's different components of that narrative content. So the one I was talking about before was like social status threat and boost, but there can also be other social contexts like social connection or lack of connection. And this is where I was trying to connect it with the moral matrices that Jonathan Haidt puts forward, because his moral matrices are grounded in emotions. He's talking about shame and disgust and anger. And so I was trying to get at, disgust, fear, respect, anger, compassion, pride, rage. Anyway, I was trying to get at sort of an evolutionary basis for these emotions that I think are human. Like, I don't think these are socially constructed. I lost the plot of what I was saying. I answered your question and then I went further.
No, that's okay, because there's a lot to come back on there. So that actually, because we spoke slightly about the narrative aspect immediately before we started, and that actually clarified things from what you were saying beforehand in my understanding, because to me, I actually don't think you and Lisa Feldman Barrett are that far apart on this particular aspect, because I think that what she is saying, in my interpretation, is that there is this spectrum of affect, and that we exist on certain places within that, and that is natural. And I think that is, I think one aspect that she missed that is relevant to that is function, because I basically think that, and you sort of touched on it a little bit there with the threats to status, and you sort of started speaking about the evolutionary aspect, is that there's a function to different states of arousal and valence, and that also ties in with Jonathan Haidt. So, for example, you use Jonathan Haidt's moral matrix. Just to choose one at random, there's the sort of purity one, which seems to be related to emotions such as disgust, and seems to be to do with disgust and awe, if I remember rightly, and has a lot to do with contamination and things like that. So people, when faced with something potentially contaminated, are likely to feel a negative valence, and when presented with something that is going to be good for them rather than potentially contaminatory, they would experience a positive valence. And so this moral dimension, it basically serves a function to help you regulate your response in favor of things that will benefit your survival and things that will be detrimental to your survival. So there's a function to that affective state. When you put the labels on it, the labels describe a broad category that could actually serve many different functions. So you mentioned anger earlier. There are many different situations where anger might be useful, anger might arise, and anger. So if you talk about the social status thing you were talking about, if you become angry because you feel that your social status is under threat, then the function of that is to try and deter that threat and mitigate the risk there, and ultimately achieve a success, an outcome that either prevents the loss of social status or increases your social status in some way and increases your reproductive potential. So when we put a label on it, and this is why my two questions were more connected than it might have seemed on the surface, when we put a label on that, we are attaching narrative, because that label we place on it has a narrative attached because it's about the context in which it emerges. So say, for example, tears, crying, as you mentioned, in certain situations we would interpret that as upset, in certain situations we would interpret it as positive, and that element is social, the label in itself contains a narrative, and I think narrative and narrative in this sense is very similar to what she's calling construct, and so that label in itself is arbitrary because there is the same arousal, the same body mechanics in terms of the facial expression, the tears, and so on and so forth, but we recognize the context, we attach a narrative to that of, okay, that person must be feeling positive because they've just won gold at the Olympics and now they're crying. Whereas if we see that same facial expression, that same body language in a church at a funeral, then we go, okay, they're upset because their mum's just died. It's very, very different. And so that's why I was asking where the role of context is in interpreting the expression of emotion, because I think that the only way we can, I don't think we can draw any conclusion from a facial expression in and of itself without having a narrative of what that response means in the context it exists.
I almost always agree. There are some faces that I think are unmistakable, and the face of disgust, I think, is one that's incredibly compelling and universal. I don't think you can make a face of disgust and not make the other person feel disgusted. I mean, if I'm eating my lunch and someone makes a disgusted face, I want to spit out my lunch, like, because of their face. So
I can give you two contexts in which the same facial expression might be made for positive reasons.
Okay.
One is known as bass face, and it's a response to sort of electronic music such as drum and bass or dubstep, when there's a very gritty and almost a noise that to anyone who doesn't appreciate that sort of music would sound quite horrible, and it's called bass face, and people often sort of pull a disgusted face, but it's a expression of like enjoyment of that noise. Yep. The other one is when people orgasm.
Never saw that face on someone orgasming, but I'll take your word for that one. But
there's a variety of different expressions people make when orgasming, and
I know.
I think if you took a picture,
but I hope they don't make this one.
I think if you took a picture of 100 people orgasming and just completely cropped out their face and gave it to people, I think that probably a certain percentage of those people would identify as disgust without the context.
Okay. Well, fair enough. All right. I mean, yeah, that's convincing. And yeah, bass face. I've heard it called by other names, but like when certain guitarists are playing some really gnarly blues guitar, they make that face. And yeah, I get it. Okay, fine, good, all right. So she's right about the facial expressions. However, I still think that the face that people make when they're disgusted can still be universally recognized as disgust, even though it doesn't always represent disgust. Like, for what I mean is that when people in other cultures, when they are disgusted, they make that same face.
I would be interested to figure that out, because I like, in terms of see if anyone has done experiments to see the facial expression of disgust cross-culturally, because I know that she does reference quite a bit of research in this around facial expressions and universal emotions, starting with Darwin, who sort of proposed this and proposed that there's a similarity between human and animal facial expressions, and basically says that there were flaws in the methodology of those experiments that involved the weird, in the acronym way, Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, weird experimenters suggesting or imposing their views of emotions onto the test subjects in different cultures. There's basically some level of bias built into the experiments, and when measures are taken to avoid that, then the universality becomes significantly reduced in terms of how recognizable or distinct facial features are. But again, this is a place where I feel like she overstated things. So she spoke about, I think the tribe are called a Kung or something like that. Mm-hmm. I know that it starts with an exclamation mark, and I know that's supposed to mean a click, but I'm almost definitely not going to be able to pronounce it as it's supposed to be. And she says they don't have a word for fear, so they don't have a concept for fear, and she basically saying, therefore they don't have fear. And this is where I feel like she makes this error quite frequently, where she isn't very clear on exactly what she means by a terminology, and it makes it murky and seems like she's making a category error, because what she means by emotions is the attachment of that narrative context, that narrative that we were sort of discussing, whereas they do have words for fear. It just also includes several other things, so it's not specifically about fear. And there's no way that a member of this tribe encounters a dangerous predator and a threat to life and does not experience negative affect, negative valence and high arousal in their affect, which serves a function of survival and threat evasion. So the affect still exists, and what she is basically saying is socially constructed is the narrative that is created by the label. And that, to me, her logic is slightly backwards, because what she then basically does in her argumentation is use the word emotion to refer solely to a set of behaviors, actions and expressions that are associated with that affect in a given context. So she's basically saying the behaviors of the emotion and not the feeling, which I don't think is how most people interpret the word emotion. So she's categorizing emotion and affect separately in that way, but because I'm not calling her woke, because I don't think she is.
She is.
Yeah, I think that her argumentation will appeal to people who adopt the woke worldview, because I think that it's so heavily reliant on social construction. I've heard interviews with her where she's comes across less as woke, but it reminds me of that trick that the woke play, where they sort of change the definition of a word without telling you they've changed the definition of the word, and then they're sort of like, but you're using our word, so it must mean what we decided it means and not what you think it means, and it sort of makes the conversation very difficult. And I think that was a big error she made within the book.
So, Robin, I feel like I again didn't answer your second question. But maybe I did and forgot.
The second question was, what role does context play in interpreting emotions? And I feel like you didn't answer it directly, but the conversation we've had since has made the question redundant.
Yeah. So,
unless you feel you have something more to say on it.
I mean, context absolutely plays every possible role that it could, for sure. And I think she doesn't go to where I would have hoped that she would go with that information. She seems to think that if you have more words for an emotion, that'll help you, instead of trying instead to piece apart valence, arousal, and narrative. Like, you don't need an emotion word. You really don't. You just need to get down to what the narrative is, and and what are the human needs, or as she would say, goals that underlie that narrative. So if you're angry, it's really good to get, as soon as possible, understand what is the narrative that's underlying that anger, so that you can choose to A, abandon that narrative, or B, embrace it and work for something.
Yeah, I wasn't convinced. So I never think there is any harm done in becoming more articulate and giving yourself a wider vocabulary. So I didn't really have an objection to that recommendation of learning more emotion words, just based on the fact that it's useful and generally a positive thing for people to have more words at their disposal to express themselves. But I think that I don't think it's necessary for what she was proposing it's necessary for. I think it's useful for communicating emotional states to one another, and I think there is a social utility in having, the primary utility of all language is social, isn't it? Because it's for communicating. Yeah. I'm sort of going down a redundant path there.
She had this thing in chapter 9 where she was talking about, how to teach the social constructions that are, the social constructions of emotion. And, there was a boy that fell down and now he's crying. And she says in the book, you would tell your child, see that boy, he's crying because he's sad. I'm just like, he's not sad. He fell down. He's either in pain or he's surprised. His dignity might be hurt. I mean, there's all kinds of feelings that he might be having. How dare she say that the boy's crying because he's sad?
Well, I actually think that this is a flawed logic in the conclusion she sort of drew from that, because what I took from the affective spectrums is that emotions are far more complicated and contain many more elements than any single label would ever give them, no matter how many labels you have, and that actually almost removing the labels is more beneficial, where you go, okay, how do I feel? Do I feel highly alert, highly aroused? Do I feel lethargic and low arousal? Why might that be? Do I feel positive? Do I feel negative? How do these intersect with one another? And to sort of take the label and the concept that's associated with that label out of the picture and just tune in to what you're actually experiencing in all of its nuances and subtleties that couldn't possibly be captured by terminology.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I want to tell a story that I already told to you, but I think it might be edifying for this conversation. So I had a really humorous experience of that very thing that you're talking about. I woke up in the middle of the night one night and I was full of anxiety because I hadn't weeded the front garden, and I was just I was totally obsessing over the garden, and I felt like I was going to die, and this total sense of doom, anxiety. Oh, the garden, and I kept, I really wanted to go back to sleep. And I didn't want to have anxiety about the garden. And I'm like, you don't care? Like, no, actually, the garden's pretty good. You're fine. It's not a problem. Really, you're fine. Stop being anxious about the garden. And then I instantly started feeling anxious about something else. I forget what, something equally silly. And I obsessed about that for a while. And then I'm like, no, actually, that's not a problem. Stop being anxious about this. And then I got very tired of having to talk myself out of these ridiculous feelings of anxiety. So I decided to say, well, how are you really feeling? What is actually going on? And so I realized that my heart rate was high, and that I had a sour taste in my mouth, and my stomach hurt. So the stomach hurting, and the high heart rate, that definitely goes along with anxiety. And I realized I had heartburn. And the minute I realized, oh, you have heartburn. Well, I just got up and ate I maybe got up and ate a Tums. Maybe not. Either I did that or not, and I fell promptly asleep. So I wasn't investigating the narrative. I wasn't thinking about the garden. I wasn't like interrogating my, mood about this, that, and the other. I was just like, well, what's really going on physically? I figured out what it was. Problem solved, which just proves that she is wrong when she says that the rational mind cannot regulate emotion. Your rational mind can absolutely regulate emotion once you find out what your affect is and why.
Well, I would say that is an example of the difference between prediction and correction, or prediction and reaction there, because your brain was basically saying there is something wrong and it's creating a sense of anxiety. And Jordan Peterson actually talks about this sometimes, where he basically characterizes anxiety as a product of entropy, where he basically says that the further you are away from your goal, and if something in the process goes wrong, so he always uses an example of if you're driving a car to a destination and the car breaks down, your anxiety increases because suddenly the number of options that exist, the number of potentialities that exist in the world have just increased drastically. Whereas when the car is working and you get closer to your goal, the number of potentialities is decreased. So you have this sort of entropic effect creating anxiety. And I think this ties in very clearly with the predictive brain, because basically you're detecting that something is wrong there with some physiological feeling, a physiological symptom, and your brain is going, what are the number of possibilities for what could be wrong here? And it's going, is it the garden? Have I left the kettle on? Is it, something like, is coming up with all these potentialities? And then you sort of gone, okay, well, let's look at what the actual options are and discount some of those predictions, because thoughts don't emerge, like the thoughts are emergent. Like you don't know where thoughts come from. You sort of are there and then they appear in your head. And whenever I have a fever, or if I'm sort of having stressful, disrupted sleep, my dreams always follow a similar pattern. The specifics of those patterns, and I strongly suspect that dreams relate to prediction as well. But the specifics of the dream vary quite a lot, but my dream always involves some sort of problem-solving task and me obsessing over one particular thing and feeling like I have to get it right and not being able to do it. And it's almost like I'm just overthinking in my dream about this. And then I'll wake up feeling really stressed, and I'll have this sort of uneasy feeling of like, oh, I just need to solve this problem. And sometimes I'll sort of be slipping in and out of consciousness. And as I come into consciousness, I'm thinking about the problem that was occurring in my dream. It particularly happens when I have a fever, and it absolutely does my head in. It's a very unpleasant experience. And that seems to be a similar pattern where it's like, there is an issue. What could the issue possibly be? There's an infinite number of potentialities for what could be wrong here. And as you make a conscious effort, these sort of thoughts and ideas are appearing in your head of what it might be. And as you make a conscious effort to slow that down and gain some control over it, and I think this is why meditation is so useful, because you're able to sort of slow down and acknowledge the thoughts as they're emerging and sort of sort them out, and almost take a step back and look at them emerging. And that sort of sounds like it's what you've done. You've taken a step back and look at all these predictions emerging and going, actually, what is there? And then you've narrowed down the number of potentialities. And as you've narrowed those down, your anxiety and your physiological response has decreased, because there's been the level of chaos has been reduced and the level of order has been increased, and therefore you feel more comfortable and at ease, and then you can address the problem as you find a more accurate prediction to what the problem is. Because you could have gone and taken I don't know, Tums is presumably some sort of heartburn medication. We have equivalents here, but
calcium carbonate.
Yeah, we don't have the brand here, but we have equivalents. And you could have taken that, and it did nothing, because it could have the issue could have been something else. Or you could have taken that and the issue could have been something else, but you felt better because you'd taken a course of action that led you to believe that the number of potentialities was reduced. So your brain wasn't working to create the sense of arousal in response to the number of potential negative predictions that it's making in terms of there being something going wrong. And so that would be a placebo effect created by the impact of choosing a course of action on your brain and its predictions.
You had me up until placebo effect, and I really appreciate the fact that you brought up the fact that I might have been wrong about the heartburn. Like I might have actually been having a heart attack. That's not very likely, but it's possible. And when I realized that my problem was heartburn and then promptly fell asleep, it's not, as you just said, it's not necessarily that was the problem, but it was that I decided that was the problem. And I think I was right, actually, because I have evidence now, but I didn't have a heart attack, but I might have been having one. So it was the fact that I narrowed it down to one thing. I don't remember if I took action or not. But I appreciate that it was the narrowing down of potentialities and just picking one. And frankly, I was so relieved that I actually wasn't feeling anxiety. That's why I was able to fall asleep. Anyway, but as to the placebo, I'm not sure about that part, but I'm also not sure it's important. And I want to say something that's important to me before I forget about it. Yeah. So it's about thoughts. I wonder, and I'm coming to think this is true. I think that thoughts, so I was already talking about narratives and emotions. So narrative and emotion, I think, are just, they're inextricably linked. And I I think thoughts and emotions are also inextricably linked. And when the thoughts arise in the mind, they arise in the mind just the same way that emotions arise in the mind. And sometimes thoughts look like emotions, and sometimes emotions look like thoughts. I mean, a great example is suicidal ideation. You know, what the hell is that? You know, why is that? Why is that a set of thoughts? Well, it can come from, well, I think it comes from, or for me, it can come from interoceptive error, also called depression. But I've begun calling it interoceptive error because I think depression is a really limited word. But so if your brain is concerned about your body, and she talks in the book about body budgeting, and I think that's actually a really cool part of the book that I wish were expanded upon. But anyway, so your brain has all these concerns about your body budget, the state of your body, which is looked after through this thing called interoception. So it's your brain looking after your body, and your brain can say, "Oh, something's wrong." And so it'll produce what she calls predictions, and what I might call stories or feelings or emotions or thoughts. And it's like, it almost doesn't matter whether it's predictions, stories, thoughts, or feelings. It's just this phenomenon of your brain coming up with something as a result of its concerns about your body budget. And as I've learned to read my thoughts as not thoughts, but instead reading them as, I try to bring them to emotions, but then I really try to bring it to body budget. Like, the sooner I get to body budget, the relief is just so great. And as I practice going from crazy dark thoughts or really creepy feelings in my body to, oh, this is just interoceptive error. Bing! It's like problem solved, fatigue goes away, dark thoughts disappear. So I just wanted to point that out.
Well, I think that the thing about narrative and prediction being one and the same. So part of there's something I need to come back to at some point, because I feel like it needs to be given credit for its value within the book, but I'll try and make a mental note of it. So that the prediction and narrative being the same thing, I think that it's fairly clear that we fundamentally think in narrative. And so a prediction, say, to go back to our example from the beginning, say, there is a snake present and the snake is a threat to me. That is a narrative. That's a story. There's a narrative attached to that, and that is a prediction. So to me, they're impossible to distinguish between one another when you strip narrative down to its most sort of basic form, particularly as the predictions, when you set that scene, are then, here are a number of courses of action, and I will attribute. So the body budget thing is basically, what effective state do I need to be in to deal with this, and it's basically, what's the minimal amount of energy that I need to attribute to this situation and being aroused and being prepared to deal with it, isn't it? Because you want to not exhaust yourself by being in a constant state of high arousal, negative valence, but you want to be able to go into those situations when the situation warrants it. And so you basically tell yourself loads of stories, and one of them is there's a snake here and that's a threat to me. One of them is there's a courgette on the floor that looks like a snake, and maybe I should pick it up and put it back in the veg basket. So every prediction is not just a prediction about what the current context is, it's also about what the most appropriate course of action in response to that is. So it's inherently narrative driven, and I think this is why this is part of why I think it's so naive for us to attempt to reject religion effectively, because I think that the idea, the sort of materialist atheist idea that we can create a rational moral framework, I think it, particularly if you use concepts of evolutionary psychology and sort of emergent morality within animals, I think there is evidence to suggest that we can come some way to establishing a rational moral framework. I think it's impossible for us to create a rational moral framework and widely adopt it without leaving it open to significant corruption. But the corruption issue is a human issue as well. So I'm not saying that religion isn't corruptible, because clearly it is. But when you embody that moral framework in a narrative, that is when it's most easily going to be absorbed by people, because our minds are suited to narrative. And so I think that's why I think that the religious framework will always be a more successful one than any rational moral framework, because human psychology isn't structured such that non-narrative models of thinking are particularly compatible, I guess.
So you just said a lot, and I'm sorry to say that I have a question about what you said at the beginning.
Yep, go on.
And because I don't want to lose track of what you were saying about religion, but when the cat jumps at the cucumber, does the cat have a narrative? Because she would say no. The author would say that the cat does not have a narrative, that the cat is jumping, why? Instinctively? So, and I do myself feel that there's a difference between the things that happen extremely quickly in one's head, and then the things that happen slightly more slowly. So, if my brain thinks I see a snake and I jump, I wouldn't call that narrative. I would just call that instinct, or, prediction or whatever. I mean, maybe it has a narrative purpose or something, but it just doesn't feel like narrative to me. And the fact that the cat jumps also, I think, is evidence for that, is a reason to say that it's not narrative. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think this is probably a more fruitful direction to go down the religion direction anyway, because I think the religion wants such a deep rabbit hole that's often completely opposite direction. I think it's, several other podcasts in and of itself. I think the narrative is implicit rather than explicit. So I think when I would say that the cat does have a narrative, when you strip a narrative back to being I'm trying to think of the right way to define narrative, because I would say the narrative is basically just I'm I'm trying not to make a circular definition here because I feel like I'm going to end up using the word narrative in trying to, but it's basically a sequence of events that have a sequence of connected events would ultimately be a narrative, I would say.
I think narrative depends on language. I don't know that you can have a narrative without language.
So would you say that, so we don't necessarily have to think in words, but we can only communicate our thoughts through words.
True. So you can also think in pictures, and you can think sort of abstractly, but I still think that narrative has to do with thinking, and it's the kind of thinking that a cat does not do.
So if I was to say there is a snake present, and I should move away from that snake, would that be a narrative in your mind? Would that, because that there's a context and a course of action relating from it, and it's not a Dostoevsky novel by any means, but it is a sequence of connected events within a context.
But see, I react to the snake before I know that I've seen the snake.
Yes, but that's why I say it's implicit rather than explicit, because you wouldn't react to the snake if your brain wasn't saying, there is a snake, I should move away from the snake. Because without that,
the brain I don't think the brain is saying I should move away from the snake. I think the brain is saying, there's a snake, you are jumping right now, even as we speak.
But why would you be jumping if the brain wasn't saying you should move away from the snake?
Right, but it's not saying you should move away from the snake. It's you are jumping right now.
Yes. So it's not giving you a future directive, because it's by the time you've registered it, it's already happening. But
yeah,
it's deciding that moving away from the snake is the optimum action in that, based on probability of it being a snake and being a threat. It's saying that's the optimum course of action in that scenario.
Okay, if the brain has time to figure out all these probabilities, I don't know. I really thought the brain was just like primed to jump at a snake. Like, is it really going to spend time on pieces of string and zucchinis? Getting it back to the very beginning. Like, does the brain take the time to think about cucumbers when it sees a snake?
Well, this is why. So I think that one of the issues is that we don't know how many predictions the brain is making at any given time, and I don't know how we would ever be able to measure that. But that's why it must be probabilistic, because say if there was 1,000 predictions that were run almost instantaneously in tandem, and in 501 of those there is a snake, because or there is enough of those in which it's a snake that the snake is a credible threat, then the optimum course of action is to react as if it's a snake and move away from it. And so I think that the fact that you are jumping means something cognitively has gone, there is probably a snake and the best course of action is to move away from it, even if taking the time to say that sentence takes infinitely longer than the actual reaction does.
What's the difference between cognition and instinct? Or are they the same? Because you seem to have used it synonymously just there.
So I was using cognition then just to refer to brain functioning. And I think that therefore instinct comes under it, because you don't act without your brain functioning. You can't move without signals going through your brain to prompt movement. So I think that the course of action implies that course of action is probably, given the information available to you at that time, given the context as you are perceiving it in that moment, the optimum course of action. I think that is implied in the jumping.
Okay, so here's my question. The optimization, I would have thought that the probability experiments being run were already run throughout evolutionary history, and that the brain shouldn't need to run it shouldn't need to do anything. It just goes snake jump. I have no reason to say that the brain is doing all this other stuff, because I think it did all that stuff before, like millions of years before.
But for it to have done that, so the way that would work from an evolutionary perspective is that those who possess a brain that say snake jump will have survived at a higher rate than those who see snake don't jump. But the brain is still saying that. It's not that activity doesn't happen in the brain because it's happened over all the time. So it will.
But how can you say that it's running simultaneous predictions is my question. How on earth do you know that? Who says and why?
Because I'm extrapolating from it would be very inconsistent from the other things we've discussed in terms of prediction. So say like your anxiety that related to heartburn, we used that as an example of your brain was running predictions to try and find out what the problem was until it settled on a solution. Same with
but I don't agree, though. I don't necessarily agree. My brain might have just come up with a single story and ran that story until I told it to stop, and then it came up with another story. I have no evidence that it was running multiple stories at once and then deciding on one.
So I'm trying to track back through quite a lot of our conversation here, because I feel like I was under the impression that we'd made more progress with that than we had, and now I'm struggling to run it all back.
So prediction is fine. Okay, I'm predicting something, and then I need to correct for prediction error.
Yeah.
Why? I have no reason to think that's a multiple thing. Why shouldn't it just be a single thing?
I don't think it would work as a single thing, because I think that there is too much space for error that you would find. It would anticipate a huge amount of cognitive ability to predict accurately to do that. And so when we spoke about so I stole Jordan Peterson's example of the car breaking down and the number of potentialities increasing, and those, considering all those potentialities, is running simultaneous predictions, is it not? Because there's basically a series of if this then that, if this then that.
So there's what is going on in our mind consciously, and then there's what is going on in our mind subconsciously, and then there's what is going on in our mind almost instantaneously. And those things, I think, are all very different. and it's the super quick thinking that I'm bumping up against. I haven't been presented with any science. I've only been presented with a story.
Okay, so I guess that's partially done on some of the evidence that was provided within the book was basically of the communication pathways within the brain and the large amount that was going on in the brain and feeding back to the visual cortex, and then that was sending information to the eye, and then a small amount of information was being transferred back from the eye to the visual cortex. So this suggested that the brain was feeding into the eye as well as the eye feeding into the brain. So that wouldn't make sense unless there was some element of prediction going on there. And I think it was also to do with the amount of information that gets returned to the brain. And this is where you sort of get the
amount of information that gets what?
The information that gets communicated back. So if you look at the pathway from I'm so bad at neuroanatomy, but if you look at basically the pathway from the main sort of bulk of the brain to the visual cortex to the eye and back, then there appears to be more information being transferred to the eye than from the eye all the way back to the brain.
Okay.
And
once again, you've explained it better.
She explained that quite clearly, and with reference to research papers. I know because I've stolen those references to use them in an assignment. so I've read through those papers. I don't. There was I can't remember his name now. But our mutual friend Neil, he's become very captivated, that's the word I'm looking for, by idealism by a guy called Kastrup, whose first name I forget. And there was a guest recently on Jordan Peterson's podcast who was discussing very similar ideas, where this is basically the idea that we had of sort of us having very limited access to the objective world because consciousness sort of precedes it, and the argument was that in evolutionary terms it wouldn't make sense for us to be able to perceive the world objectively because it would be incredibly resource intensive, and therefore we would evolve to see the things that we need to see based on their function or utility for sort of evolutionary purposes. And so that ties quite a lot in with the prediction, I think. And when I consider that with the sort of basically when I consider the evidence for prediction and a sort of consider that argumentation, which I find certainly the evolutionary argument for us not perceiving the world objectively makes complete sense, and I don't see. I mean, were that wrong, then a significant amount of the things I believe I know would also be wrong, and it would be very hard for me to reconcile those things. That's not to say that means it's inherently right. I could be wrong about absolutely everything. Who knows? And then considering the other ways, the sort of data transfer within the brain, and considering the phenomenological experience of sort of anxious situations, like I was saying with the spider, and then interpreting other things as a spider and so on, it seems unlikely to me to then go, but the instinctive brain doesn't work on multiple predictions. It works completely distinctly from the operating of the other forms of cognition that are more sort of medium and long term. So I guess I'm following a logical trail to presume that the instinctual brain is operating in a similar model, but what is very likely the case is that the more time you have, the more predictions there is the potential for. And so in that situation, it might be that rather than running 1,000 predictions, so obviously the numbers are arbitrary because we can't, I don't know how we would ever be able to measure the number of predictions that we're making. But that doesn't mean that technology won't evolve beyond my imagination in the future and make it possible. But say rather than running 1,000 predictions, it has a fraction of a second to run 4 predictions or something like that. So I assume there's a degree of that happening because it just seems logical that the more time there is, the more predictions you can run. So we got onto this with the concept of narrative and whether predictions and narratives are the same thing. And so I would say that every prediction has an implicit narrative to it because it is defining an interpretation of the context and a course of action within that. So it transcends an individual moment of time, because your prediction basically accounts for what has run up to that situation because you're interpreting the context. It accounts for the present because it's interpreting the immediate input that it's getting, and it's accounting for the future because it's choosing a course of action. So that's probably what I was lacking in my my definition of narrative, is that there's a sequential consideration of different time frames, and using that definition, I would say that the cat reacting to a cucumber has an implicit narrative. I just don't think that the cat can communicate that in a way that we would understand, because the cat is also saying, based on the past, the immediate past, the present, and the present, I believe there is a snake, and the most appropriate course of action for the future is to move away from that snake, even if that is an instantaneous or appearing instantaneous function of the brain. And so I would consider that narrative as well.
So I am struck with a sense of rather profound importance of this concept. And I don't know if that's just because my brain is making this wacky prediction that it's profoundly important, or if it's really true. But I think it has a lot of implications. And you were connecting narrative to religion before, and it can connect to all kinds of things. And it can just have all manner of implications, and it can have implications for cats and for people, and in multiple contexts that I really want to think about more. This is all very interesting.
Well, for all the flaws in the book, I found that the book, of all the books that I read quite a lot, although less lately than I have done previously. For all the books that I've read, say over the last year, I feel like this one had so many connotations, even in the places where her logic was flawed. The things that she was saying that were of value had so many connotations that I've been thinking about it all the time, which is why I didn't read. I think it was probably March or April that I listened to the audiobook of this. So we're talking about 6 months at least, and I feel like I wouldn't feel that confident in saying there's a single day that's passed since where I haven't thought about something connected with the thoughts that arose from the book. Even though, as time progressed, my thoughts became more critical of many aspects of the book, I still feel like there are many things within it that do have profound implications. And it's interesting that you said just before we got on the call about the I can't remember. So Lisa Feldman Barrett basically said that because she did that changing of the definition of emotion to relate to the actions associated with the concept rather than the affective state, that social construction element seems to suggest that animals did not do it. And I think that there is something that we didn't address within the conversation that I think she does deserve some credit for, because this was a logically consistent thing, that if you're using that definition of emotions, then I do think it is culturally constructed that the expression of a certain affective state would, the sort of behaviors that are associated with that would be culturally constructed to some degree. And, you know, like grieving is like a really typical one. Like there are very specific ways in which people react to the death of a loved one. You know, I'm always sort of reminded of the scene in Generation Kill where they shoot a child by accident, and the father basically brings up the child's dead body to them and sort of apologizes to them because they've formed a roadblock and he kept driving towards them and didn't understand their signals, and so they shot at the car thinking it was a threat, kill this child, and the father comes up and apologizes to them and then basically walks off, and he's not crying, he's not distressed or anything like that, and the soldiers are like, what's going on? That's not a reasonable response to having just had your child killed. And the interpreter goes, no, that's how they deal with that in this country. And so I suspect the affective state of extreme negative valence was present, as it would be in any cultural context, but the manifestation of that affective state, the outward expression of it, is culturally constructed. That wasn't the main point I was trying to make, and now I've forgotten what the main point I was trying to make was, because I got too in depth into that.
Well, I think that's true, and that it makes me feel better about her, because I was getting really irritated by this whole idea that emotions are socially constructed, even though I know that's true to a big extent. But I mean, grief is undeniably grief. Everyone feels grief. Grief is not frickin' socially constructed. Animals feel grief. And she even said this thing. It was pretty funny. I got to find it. I got to read the exact quote. Okay. She's talking about grief and dogs. Okay. And the dogs are performing these different behaviors. Some people see these cases as evidence of grief in dogs, but they could also be understood more simply as an effect of body budget imbalance accompanied by unpleasant affect. Well, that's what grief is.
Yeah, and that is her. That's her using her definition of emotion that isn't in sync with everyone else's, and that's where the issue arises. And I remembered what my point that I forgot was, because I was basically talking about animals and their experience of emotions, and so I'm currently listening to the audiobook of Frans de Waal, the Dutch primatologist. Are we smart enough to understand how smart animals are? And he basically makes a case that we tend to measure animal intelligence using things that we would use to measure human intelligence, but not recognizing that animals have different evolutionary environments of adaptation. And so their intelligence is formed for slightly different tasks and for different contexts. And so we have to measure them according to that. But what is clear, or what he sort of makes the case of in that, is that the accusation of anthropomorphism when we suggest that animals are experiencing human emotions, the burden of proof is actually on the critics who say anthropomorphism is wrong, rather than on the people who are anthropomorphizing, because if you are, there's no clear evolutionary reason why us and animals would evolve completely different emotional faculties, and so there might be different means of expressing it, again, because it ties in with that cultural difference. And there's a debate about whether animals can have culture, but that's why I sort of brought up about them having different means of intelligence. So they probably have different ways of expressing it, but they still have the same functional needs. So they still have the same need to evade threat that probably includes high arousal and negative valence. And I can tell you from having a cat that she's not happy if you do something that scares her. It's very clear that she's experiencing negative valence and very definite high arousal based on the speed at which she moves. And it's not making a huge logical leap to compare those. And so she might not have a culturally constructed concept of fear, but for all intents and purposes, she is experiencing something equivalent to the affective state that I would describe as fear. And so that can be applied to a whole different range of emotions. And there is clear evidence of animals experiencing something close to love for their family and members of their sort of tribe or grouping, and of other complex emotions as well, using emotion to refer to the concept of a range of affective states rather than Feldman Barrett's definition of emotion, which, unless I'm explicitly referring to her concept of emotion, definition of emotion, I'm probably not using that one because it doesn't align with my definition of an emotion.
I definitely draw the line at some states that some people ascribe to animals that I think are just wrong. Like, oh, my cat pooped on my pillow because it was mad at me for being gone, or it was resentful, or I'm just like, I don't think the cat is feeling resentful. I think there's something else going on. But so I'm kind of on her side when it comes to a great deal of narrative laden emotion concepts and animals. But
let me test that a little bit, because for example, crows, we know crows can recognize human faces, and they've run all sorts of experiments using masks and things like that. And if someone wearing a specific mask does something that the crows don't like, then someone else wearing the same mask, the crows will react negatively to that same person wearing the same mask. And if you have a local population of crows and you leave it for many years, so it's likely a different generation of crows, and there would be very few of them, there's evidence that they still react negatively to the same mask, so it's almost passed on between them. So and they will react negatively towards the person who has done something wrong. So we have evidence that's something like, it's not necessarily holding a grudge, but it is behaving in a negative way towards someone who is deemed as a threat or something like that. I had a rescue dog for a while who was an absolute nightmare, and she was not house trained and she was highly stressed, but she would defecate in the house, usually in the living room. If me or my housemate at the time had gone to our bedroom and shut the door. She suffered from very bad separation anxiety. Gone to our bedroom and shut the door, and she had become very distressed about that night. Some nights she was more calm about it. The nights where she'd become more distressed by us leaving and going into our bedroom, it was very, very common to come out the next morning and her to have defecated immediately outside the bedroom door, which was now an alternative explanation is that she spent more time there because she was more distressed, and so that's more probable that was the place. But knowing that animals are capable of responding, I think they're. I don't think it's a settled matter, but I think it's also reasonable to question whether that was based on a sort of, because I also think of like primates who will express their distaste by defecating in their hand and throwing it at people. So there is evidence of animals using feces instrumentally to express negative emotion within that. And then there's my complete anecdote that has a possible alternative explanation. It's not clear to me which of those explanations is more likely, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think the simpler and better explanation is that the dog was outside your door because she was anxious, and maybe anxiety did something to her intestinal function, and so she had to take a crap outside your door. I mean, I think that's pretty simple, rather than the dog on purpose taking a crap outside the door. That requires so much planning and narrative and a lot of internal moral conversation. It just doesn't seem likely.
I wouldn't attribute sort of vindictive intent to it, but I do think that as an expression of negative emotion in that moment, I can see a comparison between it and a primate flinging feces.
To me, it's more likely that a crapping dog or cat, inappropriately crapping dog or cat, is expressing distress more than a crap throwing primate. But anyway, I think we're good. I think this is getting a little off topic, but I believe that animals are both overly anthropomorphized in terms of these kinds of moral narratives, and also, Frans de Waal's point that it doesn't make sense that this is actually anthropomorphization when we're all subject to the same evolutionary history. And so it just doesn't make sense that we would have developed this faculty that was completely absent in other animals.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it feels slightly contradictory to say animals are too anthropomorphized and not anthropomorphized enough at the same time, but it's across.
I don't think it is.
No,
I don't think it is at all, because animals have affect, and affect is extremely important to the internal experience of emotion, and but then emotion also has this narrative aspect, and despite what you were saying about the narrative, the sort of implicit narrative that goes into instinctive responses, and I think that's a narrative that's like built up over, a billion years. There's there's a pretty intensely cognitive based, language based, or really complex, higher order thinking that goes into those kinds of social constructs of emotions that I just really doubt are present in animals, because it gets pretty sophisticated in its storytelling.
So I have one more thing that I want to test with, and then we should probably wrap up.
Okay.
but the sort of game theory offers a reasonable explanation of how evolutionary psychology can create an emergent morality. And Jaak Panksepp, the neuroscientist, did a lot of research on rats and found that if you pair rats love to play, the play is like a big part of their sort of social interaction, and they will make a significant amount of effort to get the opportunity to play. If you pair the same two rats over and over again, then the larger rat will be able to win when play fighting with the smaller rat. But if the larger rat doesn't let the smaller rat win at least 30% of the time, then the smaller rat ceases to engage in play with the larger rat. So from that emerges something that I would say is fairly akin to a concept of morality, where it's basically like a set of rules by which the game must be played to be mutually beneficial to everyone involved and enjoyable. And so you get these sort of codes of conduct that have to be adhered to. And to me, it's not a very large step from there to morality.
Yeah. And then there's also that video of the little monkey that got a cucumber instead of a grape and got all pissed off and threw it at the experimenter.
Yeah.
So
the one got the
yeah, and it wasn't fair. And it was just like, yeah, that's sure.
So it seems like animals must have some concept of fairness, or some animals must have some concept of fairness. It's probably a bit too broad to say animals. It's quite a broad group.
Yeah, I think they must have some concept. What that concept is, I don't know. But there's something going on.
So it's still not completely conclusive that the dog didn't crap outside my door for a reason.
I mean, I know what I think. I haven't changed my mind.
Yeah. I'm not.
And I still don't think it's I don't think it's a contradictory to say that they're both over and under anthropomorphized either.
I was I only got halfway through my sentence. I was going to say it feels contradictory to say that in one go, but when you're explaining the wide range of behaviors, then it makes sense, because there are different contexts in which they are and aren't over anthropomorphized.
Before we go, I want to say one thing.
Okay.
On page 13, Lisa Feldman Barrett says that West Sumatra is in Africa, and I will never forgive her for that. It's in Indonesia.
Is it?
And it's just such a crappy, lazy, stupid mistake. And maybe that's why I was set off from the very beginning.
I would never have picked up on that, because hilariously, my geography is really bad, to the point where last night I had a conversation with someone from South Africa, and we were talking about tempeh, which is a food from Indonesia. And I said, I don't even know where in the world Indonesia is. I don't know if it's in Africa or Asia.
Oh.
And so the fact that within 24 hours you've got an example somewhere, if anything, it makes me empathise with Lisa Feldman Barrett more, because she made a similar mistake to me.
All right.
All right. Cheers, Rebecca.
All right. Take care, Robin.
Bye.